Hey folks, Doug Blake with Body Design University. Welcome to another weekly study. And in today's video, we're going to talk about cardiorespiratory training intensity. Now, this is going to be out of chapter 8. And actually, what I'm going to do is kind of go over just a little bit of the study. And because remember, the goal ultimately is to help you to pass the ACE exam on the first attempt, or if you've already taken it and you didn't pass the second or whatever attempt you're on. So there's always going to be that element. But what I wanted to do today, based on a question comment from a student in the Facebook group, was asking about max heart rate and the standard deviation of max heart rate based on the original Fox formula, the 220 minus your age. I think it was the Gellish formula, Tanaka formula, and then he had mentioned the Carvone. And I just thought I gave him a response, really simple and basic. But I thought it'd be a good idea because we do get a lot of questions on what is actually going to be on the exam itself. Now, just keep in mind, please, and if you got your book, open up to chapter 8. Chapter 8's got a lot of material in it, a ton of material, and it is often one of those chapters that folks just go, how am I going to memorize all this? And the answer is you don't have to memorize all of it. I will say this, when it comes to cardiorespiratory training, the one thing you have to remember, irrespective of all of these different ways to monitor exercise intensity, ACE is concerned about one thing: ventilatory threshold. So even though you do have to understand the basic concepts around the other ways to monitor exercise intensity, they save it to the last, and they basically tell you, look, in the IFT model, it's going to be VT1 and VT2. And for the most part, with the IFT model, excuse me, it's going to be VT1 and lower than VT1 heart rates, exercise intensity below it, and between that and VT2, because remember, in the end, we're talking about the average healthy or apparently healthy person who, for the most part, unless they have some sort of exercise endeavor or goals that are more at a higher athletic level, they're not going to need to do a VT2 field test. You're not going to need to know what that heart rate is. You need to know VT1. And that's the reason I'm saying that is because that's what ACE really wants you to know. Now, remember, that's from a purely test-taking perspective as well. You're not going to get a whole lot of questions on these other ways. I mean, you will see probably one, maybe two, could be maybe a little bit more than that. But the majority of the testing that's going to occur relative to cardiovascular training is going to be based on the IFT model, where you're dealing with the zone method of determining exercise intensity, which is a little bit later on in chapter 8. Don't want to get into that part of it. I've spoken about that in other videos, but here's what I do want to do. Remember, by the way, from a purely memorization standpoint, read the material, write it over and over, draw pictures, do whatever you have to do to memorize it to pass the test. Because remember, you want to pass the test. You got to get done with that. This way you can actually start training people, okay? And when it comes to the specificity of this material, when we're talking about cardiorespiratory training and how to program your training times and your training intensities and your training volumes and things like that with your clients, ACE only cares for the most part about ventilatory threshold. And here is sort of the tip I want to give you. That's what you should be concerned about too. In the real world, for those of you that have never trained anybody, for those of you that maybe you don't train a whole lot yourself, or all you do is a lot of resistance training. When it comes to cardiorespiratory training, for the average client, I'm just giving you real world stuff right now. In the real world, we use heart rate monitors. That's welcome to the 21st century. We use heart rate monitors. Now, heart rate monitors, yes, they are generally basing, to a certain extent, their algorithms are based on predictive max heart rate equations. Not all are, And for the most part, you don't have to worry about that as long as you know what your target heart rate range is going to be. Heart rate monitors, at least they give you a guide and they tell you right then and there what your heart rate is. And yes, they do give you percent of max heart rate. It's better. It's better than the alternative, which is to have to do a talk test with people. I think I've done a talk test a couple of times with folks back in the 1980s or something like that. No, the best way to gauge intensity of training is any one of the um, uh, monitoring scenarios that they give you on page 278. Problem is that you're simply not going to use most of these. You're going to use basically, as far as ACE is concerned, you're going to use the talk test and heart rate at VT1. So when you look at page 278 and come down to the bottom, it says intensity, monitor exercise intensity. These are the ways you can do it. Come with me here for a second, and I'm going to explain this to you. Heart rate, percent of max heart rate, or percent of heart rate reserve, right? Heart rate reserve is just your predicted max heart rate or your real max heart rate minus your resting heart rate, and that gives you what's known as your heart rate reserve. But still, if you do a predictive equation for your max heart rate to calculate heart rate reserve, it's already inaccurate. Remember, there's only one real way to get an accurate max heart rate number. And they talk about it here on page 279, which is you get tested. You go in for an actual max heart rate test. Okay. And you're just not going to do that. Nobody does that. I mean, that's research level stuff. That's medical level stuff. You're not doing that with your clients. So it's totally out of the, out of the logistical possibilities for the personal trainer. So trying to get true max heart rate numbers, it's not going to happen. So if you want to use a method that still is going to use max heart rate, and by the way, that includes the Carvonen method, the heart rate reserve method, you have to use what's known as a predictive equation. And this is where, if you go on to page 280, you can see and by the way, there's a lot of different equations that are used. They're giving you the Gelish and the Tanaka formula. The original Fox formula was a 220 minus your age. Look, you can use it. It's quick, it's down and dirty, easy to use. It's not that accurate to get a true max heart rate. But remember, in the real world, okay, get away from this academic stuff. In the real world, it's good enough for the average person, to be honest with you, if that's what you want to do. Of course, again, what ACE is going to recommend is that although you can use any of these, their level of accuracy is suspect. They're going to say, and correctly, by the way, better to use metabolic markers such as breathing rate. And if you can actually measure it, your lactate levels at certain heart rates. But that's where VT1 comes in. And if you do a VT1 test, right, little field test, you got it. And you can correlate that, and you got that heart rate, it's a piece of cake. Now, everything below that heart rate is in zone 1. Everything above that heart rate is zone 2 until you get to VT2, which most people are simply not going to train to any great extent at. I'm just telling you, this is the way ACE is kind of priming you and prepping you to use this in the real world. And it's actually a pretty good way to do it, to be honest with you, if you're not going to use a max heart rate predictive equation. Back to page 278, rating of perceived exertion, RPE. Sure, it's easy to use. In other words, you ask your client on a scale of 1 to 10, where are you at? Well, I'm at an 8. How accurate is that? Again, it's better than nothing. VO2 max, metabolic equivalents, METs. By the way, yes, I know they give you on page 282 and all the way through, or excuse me, 284. Here's your METs equivalent table. Don't memorize all of those. Please don't memorize the METs that go. No, what you memorize on this table are some sort of cued areas, such as light is less than 3 MEPs, and vigorous intensity is greater than or equal to 6 METs. That's good to memorize. Okay. And of course, moderate between that 3 to 5.9. Again, in the real world, I'm trying to navigate you on two sides of the road here. Understand it, memorize as best you can some of this material, but you're not going to use that in the real world when you're actually training people. Caloric expenditure, you're simply not going to do it. How are you calculating caloric expenditure? It's just not even on the radar for a personal trainer to be using it. But there it is. Talk test and heart rate at VT1. I'm just going to tell you that when it comes to athletic training, and you can do this with runners and other endurance type athletes, if you can get a good VT1 and a good VT2 measurement, yeah, that's definitely how you would do it. If you really wanted to dial in the training programming, that would be a great way to do it. Now, of course, there's more than 3-zoned method. There's more methods than just the 3-zone like ACE uses. But remember, in this textbook, we are not talking for the most part about athletes. We're talking about apparently healthy people, and the average client that you will train, hopefully, that can afford your services, are average folks. They're generally never going to be training above VT2. Now, I'm not saying they don't get there, because you're working them hard, but that's just not a relevant component of their training program, and it could actually be relatively dangerous. So again, the point is that max heart rate or predicted max heart rate equations, yes, there is a level, low, high, moderate, or high levels of inaccuracy. The original Fox formula, which by the way was never meant to be used by the public, the 220 minus your age, it gets you close. Okay, the only problem with that formula is that it tends to overestimate actual heart rates, max heart rates for young people, and underestimates max heart rates for older individuals. So somebody like myself who's older, my max heart rate actually is measured significantly higher than what the 220 minus your age is. And by the way, max heart rate is just not a great measure of it when it comes to your performance. So, and ACE speaks about that, but that's somewhat irrelevant to the point here, which is that if you're going to use a method in the real world, there's really only a couple of methods that you're going to use. One is RPE. That was my alarm. RPE scale, right? Rating of perceived exertion, right? That's one way to do it. You can do the look test, which is another way. And the look test is what you're using concurrently with the ventilatory threshold, VT1, VT2. Again, for the sake of testing, that's the most important thing to remember. Zones, the zone training, zone 1, zone 2, zone 3, and of course in the IFT model, that's already laid out for you. That's going to be the most important thing to remember. Keep in mind that the Gellish and the Tanaka formula, there's a whole bunch of other formulas that are used out there. Are they more accurate? Yes, but they're more predictive. They're predictive as well. So they are more accurate than the original Fox equation, the 220 minus your age. But in the real world, does it matter? That it really doesn't. At the end of the day, I'm just glad that my clients are training, right? And I'm glad that they're getting their heart rate up. If I can get a little bit better accuracy on metabolic indicators, right? Basically, what we're talking about here is the breathing rate, right? So your breathing rate, tidal volume, those are really the metabolic indicators that are of most importance in the real world when I'm doing a VT1 or VT2 zone type of training scenario. Kind of the last thing I wanted to go over here with you is figure 815, because this was basically the comment or the question from the student that was asking this post was, what's the standard deviation? And the answer was basically 12 beats per minute. But that was based on the 220 minus your age equation. Here again, standard deviations. Come on, now we're going back to some really, really intense math, folks. The point is that it is significant. It only becomes significant when I'm dealing with higher level athletes that I'm really trying to dial in their training programs. And then I would like to know or get really, really close to know what their performance indicators are going to look like. And so my training for sure is going to need to be as accurate based on the most accurate physiological information I can get. Max heart rate simply is not that. And actually more research and data comes out to tell us that max heart rate really is not, it's just not the way to do it with high level athletes. With the average person, it's good enough for government work, as we used to say in the Army. It's good enough for government work. In other words, if my true max heart rate, if I measured it and my true max heart rate was 170 beats per minute, great. Now I can do my percentages. But what if I do the 220 minus your age and it comes out at 160 or 165? Is that 10-point difference really that significant for me working out every day, just trying to keep in shape? Or for the average person, 99% of the people you're going to train? The answer is no. It's really not that important, folks, to be honest with you. If you're an athlete looking for performance indicators to help you through and get you faster, stronger, whatever the case is, oh yeah, that 10, 15 points, that's significant. So you would definitely want a way to measure intensity that's much more accurate, that you can build a program off of. Just keep in mind that as you go through chapter 8, there's just a ton of information. And again, for the most part, you're not going to see a lot of this on the test. You will get some questions because chapter 8 is an important chapter. But at least ACE gives you a breakdown of all of these ways that you can measure intensity. Okay, so when you're reading through, just real quick, when you're reading through, get a good idea. You have to memorize the actual wording. Once you get to VT1 and VT2 on page 285, whoa, slow down, wake up, drink some coffee, because this is where you want to spend the majority of your time. And this is where you're going to need to really know and understand how that is related to the integrated fitness training model itself, the ABC approach, and all those other elements that go into the ACE model. I hope that this was helpful. Again, lots of information in chapter 8. I just wanted to give you a little bit of insight into the basics of kind of memorizing some of the material, but more importantly, I wanted to kind of skate over here into the real world, just so you understand that once you pass this exam, you got to be a trainer. This does not make you a good trainer. This ensures that you have some basic knowledge. Once you pass this, and we want you to pass it, once you pass it, now is the time to get some experience and actually start training people and learn what you're going to use, what you're not going to need. I will say this, the VT1 ventilatory threshold talk test measure is a great way. It really is. Using zone training methodologies could be very, very helpful once you actually start training people. So keep that in mind. If you like the videos and you like the content, please go ahead and subscribe. Hit the bell so you know when the content is coming out. And as always, Body Design University, our goal is to help you pass on the first attempt, unless it's not your first attempt, it's your second or whatever the attempt is. Let us know if you have any questions. Put them in the comments below. Let us know how we can be of assistance. Have a great weekend and look forward to seeing you next week.